Hi, and welcome to my channel. Today's video is the first in a series I'm doing for complete beginners, people who have never hooked a stitch before in their lives. By the end of this series, you'll be able to tackle any beginner level pattern you can find between Yarnspirations, Ravelry, Etsy, anywhere you're getting your patterns. Today we're going to cover picking out your supplies, the hooks and the yarn, with multiple sets of terminology for how these things are sized. It can get pretty confusing, especially if the patterns you're finding are from the UK and you live in the US or vice versa. So today I'm going to cover all the systems that are used as best I can so that you won't have any confusion. This is the video I wish existed when I first started. It would have really shortened my learning curve, and I hope it does that for you. So let's get started. Okay, so we're starting with yarn weights. Now, there are two ways that yarn weights are generally referred to. Either a name, like an actual word, or a weight number. And some yarns conveniently have both on the label, which makes it super easy. You know, because your pattern might say worsted weight, or it might say weight 4. And if you have a yarn like this, that it says worsted weight here, but at no point on this label does it say weight 4, and your pattern calls for weight 4, you won't know that this is the right weight for you. Whereas to this worsted, it says worsted on the front and has the weight 4 symbol right there for you. Yarns that have both marks are going to be really easy. No matter what your pattern calls for, you'll be able to find it that way. Ones that only have one way or the other, you have to know both systems so you can figure it out. So, for instance, this one is weight 1. And you can see it's a very thin, lightweight. It's considered super fine. It's sometimes also referred to as fingering. And this one, I don't know if that's clear enough on the screen, but you can see it says super fine, and then has the number right there, number 1. Now, if you're looking for fingering, it doesn't specifically say fingering anywhere on here. You just have to know that is another way people refer to weight 1 yarns. And this one, it says sport weight down here. It's hard to see even in person, so it's probably really hard on camera, but it says sport weight. And it also has the number 2 ball. So whether it calls for weight 2 or sport weight, you can find it. Now, this weight is very common in the UK. It is not very common in the US. So if you have a pattern from the UK that calls for sport weight, and you can't find any sport weight in stores, a lot of time what people in the US will use is the next size up, which you can see isn't a huge difference. They're pretty close. They're pretty close. They're not exact, but they are close to each other. And this is a DK, also known as a light 3. So, you know, these labels that have both on it really make it easy to identify no matter what way the pattern calls for it. But as I showed you with the Encore, not all of them have both. This one has worsted. It does not say weight 4 anywhere on it. Another thing you want to look out for with these is, as you can see, these are both worsted weight. We'll say worsted right on the label, but if you look at the strands side by side, they aren't actually the same thickness. The purple one, the Encore, is actually a little bit heavier. So that's an issue we have with standards from brand to brand. It kind of varies sometimes. So that can make it very difficult when picking for a garment where your size is important, which is why we want to look at the gauge on your label and make sure that it matches the gauge on your pattern. Any well-written pattern will have a gauge on it. Just noticing this label does not appear to have a gauge on it. Labels usually have gauges on them too. This one actually does not. So this is not the best label from Encore. It's a great yarn. I've worked with it before. I like it, but it doesn't have a good label. It does not tell you that it's a weight for. It doesn't give you a gauge. So when you're working with something like this, your best friend is going to be your tape measure if you're doing something where size matters, like a garment, and your pattern should come with a sizing chart. Like, for instance, the pattern I used to make my basic beanie says that an adult small should be 7.5 inches from top to bottom when you're done making it. So if I were working with a yarn like this that doesn't have a gauge label, I would measure as I go, and if I got the number of rows the pattern calls for and it was over or under, I would adjust accordingly. So you do want to look out for that they're not all created equal. I find most of the brands I buy, the worsted is closer to this Kramer Perfection, the slightly lighter one, but the Encore is very similar to the Red Heart Super Saver, which a lot of patterns online call for. So if your local yarn shop doesn't have Red Heart, but it does have Plymouth Encore, that's a very suitable substitute. So, you know, if you're shopping at some of your bigger box stores like Michael's or Hobby Lobby, they'll probably have bigger names like Red Heart and Karen, whereas to a local yarn shop will have smaller companies. Our last two sizes I have here are chunky, which could also be called bulky, as well as super bulky. Again, so actually, yeah. So this one is labeled chunky, and this one is labeled with super bulky, but it could be either way. It could be, this one could be called a bulky, and this one could be called a super chunky. Either way, it's just a matter of the company's choice in labeling. But you can see this one is labeled as a size 5. And this one is a 6. And you can definitely see the difference in thickness of these two strands. So this one's definitely larger. It's got a lot more poof. Now, an important thing to note, if a pattern says it can be done in any size yarn, it will always build faster and come out larger if you use a chunky or a super chunky. And these are excellent for quick blankets. Whereas if you're doing something that you want a little more smaller detail on, you want to go with something thinner, lighter. So that pretty much sums us up on yarn. Okay, now we're gonna get into hooks, and this is where the UK-US terminology really comes into play. It might be hard to see the writing on some of these because it's very fine, but I'm going to do my best to make sure that it shows. So, you know, you get your first starter set of hooks, something like this in front of you. Find a pattern you like online, download it, print it out, go to get started, and it tells you you need a size H hook. And you find yourself looking at this hook set, noticing your hooks are not labeled with letters, but with measurements. These all say millimeter numbers. None of these have letters. So which one's considered an H? You know, that is where things get confusing. So In the UK, they typically use the measurements, but in the US, they use letters. And also sometimes in the US, they'll have another number associated with it as well that corresponds with the knitting needles gauges. Like a knitting needle, a size 8 is a 5mm, and a size H/8 crochet hook is a 5mm crochet hook. So there's actually the 3 different systems. So, and this is where you really just have to memorize it or find a hook set that's labeled all 3 ways. I have a chart I wrote up for myself to memorize it. You know, I wrote this up years ago. I've been keeping it in a binder and just following along with this whenever needed, referencing it as needed. But I got these hooks recently. A local yarn shop opened up in my town, and they carry a brand called Knitter's Pride. And on the Knitter's Pride handle, you see we've got here, it's M/13. So we've got the letter system, the US system, and that number that corresponds with the knitting needles. And then it's -9mm. So you've got that UK using the metric system on the end. So no matter which way my pattern calls for the hook, I know that this is the hook that I need. You can find either Knitter's Pride or any other brand that labels their hooks this way, where you have all 3 setups right there. That would save you some time and frustration with having to memorize all of this. But if you got a starter set that does not have all 3, then you're gonna need to, unfortunately, just follow along with this part of the video and take notes, okay? So, starting with a 3.5, because that is the smallest size my chart actually has a letter for. Okay, so starting with the 3.5 here. The 3.5mm hook is an E-4 in US. So if you want to write that down, 3.5mm is an E-4. I'm going to go through each of these. Got a 4mm hook here, is a size G6. A 4.5mm hook in the US doesn't actually have a letter. It just has a 7. It's a 7, just like a 4.5mm knitting needle is a size 7 knitting needle. The 5mm, now this is probably your most commonly used hook. I'm going to tell you that right now. I use this more often than any of my other ones. Like, the coloring's starting to wear off on the end here. It's starting to turn like silvery, more so than blue, because it gets used so much. This is your size H-8. 5.5mm is the size I-9. I-9. I feel like I'm calling bingo here. 6mm is a J-10. 6.5mm is a K-10.5. A size 8mm, which I have in the Knitter's Pride, so it's actually well labeled, is an L/11. We already talked about a 9mm. This is M/13 is 9mm. Here is the, and this is really hard to see on this because it's like clear plastic, but This is from my first set ever. And they're labeled, it's 10 millimeter, and this one does have the N on it. It's N15. 15 is the number on this one. So, and this one, it's labeled with the millimeters and the N. It doesn't have that third system, that knitting needle correspondent number on it. Now, there are larger hook sizes as well, even included on this chart. This chart goes all the way up to 20 millimeter, but I've been crocheting since I was 12, and I have yet to use anything above a 10. If you're working with this super bulky, the recommended hook for this on the label is a 9 millimeter hook. So even using a 10 will give you like a softer, looser stitch. That's another thing. If you are looking for a looser stitch, you go up a hook size or a hook size and a half from the one recommended on the label. And the ones recommended on the label, sometimes this one is in millimeters. This one said 9 millimeter. This one says hook I. So you would have to know that that is a 5.5 millimeter. Hence why I said, you know, you might want to write down, go through this video, watch it a couple times if you have to, pause where needed, and write down the corresponding metric in US terms, because you never know which ones are going to be on your labels, which ones are going to be on your patterns. If you have a pattern that says it can be done in any size yarn with its corresponding hook, you need to check your label to find your corresponding hook, whatever that may be. Here's one. The DK recommends the 4 millimeter. It's so hard to get little fine ironing like that show up on camera, but that does say 4 millimeter. You can take my word for it. So if you know how to read your labels, they'll tell you what hook corresponds with your yarn. And if you know how to read, and if you read the beginning of your patterns, most of the time they'll tell you what yarn and hooks are recommended for the pattern. So if it is a looser stitch where they want you to use a larger hook, it'll say so right there on the pattern. I have an example of this right here on this wool-like, this loops and threads yarn here, because the recommended hook here for this yarn in general use is the 3.5 millimeter hook, because it's super fine, it's very small, so it wants a small hook, right? This is, you know, single strands, very thin. But for this pattern that's on the inside label, it actually recommends an 8 millimeter hook because it's got a very loose stitch going on. Otherwise, it would take forever to make something that large with yarn this small. But you have looser, larger stitches by using the larger hook. And patterns will usually tell you if they want you to do something like that. But if it says this pattern can be done in any size yarn with its corresponding hook, the corresponding hook will be on your yarn's label. So, covered all of that. The only other thing I would say needs to be covered here is if you're picking yarns for a project, the material they're made out of matters. So, for instance, if you want something to be heavy and warm, wool is better. If you want something to be light for summer wear, cotton is better. If you're trying to keep on budget, acrylics are probably better for you. A lot of yarns are a blend of these. Like, for instance, this Encore is 75% acrylic, which is why it's pretty affordable. But it's also got 25% real wool in it, so it is warmer than a cotton yarn, and it's got that weight to it. This would be okay for a sweater or a blanket if you're trying to stay on budget and not go full wool. Also, it's machine washable, which 100% wool won't be. So those are things to think about. You know, you think about what are you making? Who are you making it for? Because you're making something for a child, you don't want to go 100% wool and have it not be machine washable because it's probably getting stained. You know, things like that need to be considered. And all the care instructions and what it's made from are on the label. And we can get more into that on a project-by-project basis as I do tutorials. I might say, you know, for projects like this, I prefer a cotton yarn or an acrylic yarn, you know, as we go along. That's something you really learn over time, your preferences, what feels good in your hand, what you like to work with. But washing instructions are very important if you're making it for a child. I'll tell you that right now. You know, anytime you're making a baby blanket and doing that, it's going to get spit up on, it's going to get messy, it needs to be machine washable. So that's another thing to consider when picking your materials. So now you know everything I can tell you about choosing your materials, getting your hook, getting your yarn. How about hopping over to the next video because you're ready to start hooking some stitches.